My name is Michael Heleus. This is April 2nd, 1993, and I'm talking to you from Soundings of the Planet in Tucson, Arizona. And this is going to be a brief talk about the Schumann resonance. In 1952, a researcher by the name of W.O. Schumann had discovered that there was an ionospheric cavity resonance, which was, he thought, set off by a lightning. That is, lightning storms around the world, he thought, sent out electromagnetic signals which would be reflected off the ionosphere and reflected around the globe. And he found that there was wide fluctuations depending on the frequency and direction of the storms, but by and large there were certain average frequencies that emerged for what's come to be known as the Schumann ionospheric cavity resonance, or just the Schumann for short. He found that primarily there was a wave that went completely around the Earth, that went from, say, point A at the North Pole to point B, the South Pole, and back, something between 7.5 and 8 cycles a second. And this would fluctuate depending on what the season was, what the conditions of the ionosphere were, whether or not there were solar storms going on, and that sort of thing. But the average frequency that came to be worked out over the years by other researchers that followed in Schumann's footsteps averaged to 7.83 cycles per second. Repeat, 7.83 cycles per second. This particular frequency has been found to be beneficial for brainwave entrainment in human beings. This is more or less a pulse or a rhythm of nature that's unique to this planet. Other planets which have magnetic fields also would have their own Schumann resonances. That is, if they have an atmosphere that would allow a wave to be refracted around the planet. Otherwise, what you would have would be called a lithospheric Schumann resonance, where the EMF energy goes through the crust of the planet. Now on Earth, when this happens, a standing wave is set up when there's a frequency of 7.48 cycles approximately. Research has been done that shows that the atmospheric Schumann resonance, which is 7.83 cycles, actually has higher nodes of resonance. And these are found approximately by a formula whereby the number of the node is multiplied by the lithospheric Schumann resonance in the following way. It's the square root of the node number times the node number plus 1 that gives the frequency. So the top frequency, or node 5, is about 30 to 31.5 cycles. If you start with 7.83 and multiply out when n equals values from 1 through 5, then you have values that go 7.83, about 10.5, and then on up to around 30. And all of these are psychoactive frequencies according to what they stimulate in a person. Now, my own work has to do with the harmonic regime of the motions of the solar system as a whole, and this relates to the Schumann resonance also. Those of you who are viewing this who are into brainwave research might be aware of a device called the mind mirror, which shows you on LEDs a power spectrum off of each one of the hemispheres differentially in several different bandwidths. Each row of LEDs represents a bandwidth from 0 cycles or DC up to, say, about 32 hertz on the standard model. And in different states of consciousness, different forms or contours of the power spectrum occur. In the awakened mind state, for example, there's a bulge of frequencies and a tuck and another bulge. Well, the tuck occurs at the Schumann resonance for the atmosphere, 7.83 cycles. Just above that, there's another bulge, and it turns out that bulge is direct octave shifts of the planetary motions for about half the solar system, the so-called, as I call them, left brain planets like Mercury and Mars, Saturn and Pluto. These gather and create a bandwidth of about a cycle to a cycle and a half, where they all click together above the Schumann by a cycle and a half or thereabouts. And then below it there's another bulge, and this is due to the resonances of the planets that go with the right brain or activate the right brain function. And they're a little bit further from the tuck than the ones for the left brain. So what you're doing when you've got your brain stimulated to put out a lot of energy in these two bandwidths and knock out the Schumann is that you're tuned in on the solar system, or a more advanced level of consciousness than what you would be tuned in on if you were tuned in on the Schumann ionospheric cavity resonance, which is at that 7.5 to 8 cycle range. See, if you drop out the Schumann resonance, then you can be more in touch with the more cosmic vibes of the solar system. There's a researcher in Gainesville, Florida, named Dr. Philip Callahan, who's written a book called Tuning into Nature, which I highly recommend to you. Dr. Callahan is basically an entomologist, but he got into cosmic resonance studies through the back door by observing that insect antennae actually replicate man-made antennae. All the various forms of man-made antennae can be found in insect antennas. And the insects, it turns out, like to listen to the Schumann resonance. In fact, Dr. Callahan told me that flies often will beat their wings at an octave of the Schumann resonance, an octave being a frequency doubling here. So we go from 7.5 to 15 to 30 to 60, which happens to be house current frequency, and on up to about 120. Well, I can tell you from my own experience in New Mexico that flies often do beat their wings at around 120 cycles a second, as if they were trying to get some energy by resonating with an octave of the Schumann resonance. The question arises, just what is resonance, besides just a nice buzzword? Well, let's take the example of a common swing. It has a definite length of suspension, and if someone's sitting in it and swinging, it has a definite period or frequency of oscillation. Let's say that somebody comes along and decides to push the person who's swinging. If they push every time the swing comes up, then there's a smooth addition of energy to the system. This is called resonance. What will happen is the swing will have a bigger and bigger arc or amplitude as the energy is added to the system. But what will happen if the person pushes with some other frequency than what the swing's natural frequency is? The result will be destructive interference or anti-resonance, and the swing will eventually more or less stop. So now let's apply this concept of resonance to ionospheric cavity, that is the Earth's atmosphere and what it does. Say this is the Earth, the atmosphere is a ring around it, which is thin, and it fades out going out into space. But as it does so, it changes its quality in such a way that radio waves emitted from some point on the surface will bounce off of what's called the E or F layer of the ionosphere, and then it will come down and strike the Earth somewhere else. And this is why we have great distances being received readily with short wave. Well, it keeps on bouncing, and it'll go right around the Earth if it's allowed to. And if the frequency is such that it comes back on the same place where it was emitted, that is a resonance. But if the frequency is shifted from whatever that is, say 7.5 cycles here, then it's not going to arrive at the same place again, and it won't add on to the emitted wave. Instead, it's going to subtract or interfere with it, and you get this muddy interference pattern going around the Earth. So the Schumann resonance and its octaves are the places where, when a wave is emitted from point A, it's going to come around back exactly to point A again.
Okay, so that's a physical resonance,
yes,
of the cavity around the Earth in the related to the ionosphere.
Yes, that is the 7.83 main node cycle. And these other nodes result from the fact that there are other sideband effects, as they're called, that propagate out from this point, which happen to come back and coincide exactly at the originating point when you have these special multiples of the basic frequency.
So since our planet has had this this resonance for its existence, basically, at least of life that we know of it, that resonance is an integral part of the natural system in relation to events that have some sort of frequency to them.
Yes.
For instance, crickets. Cricketing and
it's good that you should point that out, because if you'll just listen to cicadas during the summer, they'll tend to go, and in fact that is usually a sub-octave of the Schumann resonance. They like particularly 3 3/4 and half of that to match to, just like flies like to have 3 octaves up as a frequency to match.
And then dolphins and whales.
Dolphins and whales seem to be able to hear the cosmic resonances too, because of the architecture of their skulls, just as human beings do when they're quiet enough to pay attention to it. The inner sounds of human beings also are these planetary or cosmic sounds, including the Schumann and its harmonics.
Also, nerve cells fire at that frequency, don't they? 7.42
yes, if you,
or something like that?
If the nerves in the brain are firing at 7.5 cycles a second, then there is an exchange of energy between the Earth's electromagnetic field and the minuscule field that normally surrounds the brain. And a person will find their consciousness expanding around the planet, literally, when they're in that state.
So that is the natural, in a way, could we call that a natural, peaceful state of balance to be in this harmonic resonance, and that connects us with much greater plane of living being?
Yes, in general it will, if you get in touch with that particular frequency and overcome your own fears of being centered in that frequency, which some will feel when they're exposed to this. Then you come into a balance of the left and right hemispheres, because basically the Schumann resonance stands between what normally entrains the left brain and the right brain, as I explained earlier. And so if you focus on the Schumann, then you get a balance that allows you to expand throughout the Earth's field. Mm-hmm. I think some creatures like the dolphins are able to do that naturally. Mm-hmm. And I think also that the frequencies that they put out with their utterances in many cases will set up a sonic lattice or grid in the ocean, whereby standing waves are created in the ocean, whereby they can store information and retrieve it, or they can be simultaneously in nodes at great separations and get an instant transference as if it were telepathy.
And that's almost a similar analogy would be like standing under a dome in Congress, or in some of these domes that...
Yes, it's similar to what happens if you're in an elliptical room and you stand in one focus and your friend stands in the other focus, and you whisper and the other friend can hear you only if they're standing right near that other focus. Mm-hmm. And anybody else in the room isn't going to hear because the sound isn't concentrated enough.
Mm-hmm. So there are definite physical relationships, and that's what I think, it takes this concept of the earth resonance out of the kind of mystical area. It's a very physical, real
it's
phenomenon.
Tangible to instruments. For example, if you were to lay out about a mile of wire, Dean and I have a friend, Shine Richards, who's actually done this, laid out a mile of wire near Pie Town, New Mexico, and hooked it up to his oscilloscope. He was able to see the fluctuations of voltage level that oscillated approximating to 7 to 8 cycles, which was the Schumann resonance. Of course, it wasn't stable. It varied around depending on what ambient conditions were. And further, there were artificial variations that were being put into that. All efforts that we make as individuals to synchronize or balance the functioning of our left and right hemisphere, that is, the linear processes with the exponential ones, will create a definite force for harmony and peace in the world, because these electromagnetic crepitations going out from the brain, when we're in the Schumann resonance frequency, will travel around the planet literally, even at this tiny, tiny amperage that we're putting out. And if you have enough minds that are entrained or in sync this way, then you can literally think peace into a reality. Or its opposite, if you've got the hemispheres split. Count Korzybski, in his work in general semantics, was the one who found that the linear process in society and its non-balance with the non-linear processes was actually the root cause of war. At least one of them. In my researches, I found another one having to do with the structure of the universe in terms of electrodynamics of the cosmos. That is, positive charges are on the inside of atoms and molecules and negatives are outside. Turns around halfway up and then there's a reversal, so that the most electronegative are inside at the greatest levels of concentration, like galaxies and so on. Now, this is explained on a videotape that I put out through Borderland Sciences Research Foundation, P.O. Box 409, Garberville, California. Phone number is area code 707-986-7211, where I explain my work in what's called Astrosonics, or cosmic resonance, and I show how this electrodynamics of the cosmos can be reconciled using forces like light and sound to effect more peaceful and harmonious solutions at our level of magnitude in the universe. And the Schumann resonance is a critical factor in this particular process. In fact, at this point, let me...
Yeah, I'm right on. I've got a very good image on your paper here. So.
Oh, good. At this point, is it on?
Yeah.
At this point, let me summarize basically what I have found through years of research. Since I discovered it was possible to scale planetary motion into the audio range and get predictable psychological effects according to astrological theory, I find that these planetary shiftings bunch, just as it with the mind mirror, into two groups. We have the bunch that's above the Schumann resonance here, which approximate to C sharp to D on a piano, and those that are below that approximate to A and A flat. And then there's the Schumann resonance itself that approximates to a B. So we have Mercury, Sun, or Earth, Sun, which are exchangeable, Mars, Saturn, and Pluto being the so-called malefic or harsh planets. They're really left brain or linear in their processing. Then there is the other family of planets, Moon, Venus, Uranus, and Neptune, which activate or resonate with the right brain. And those have traditionally been considered more benefic than malefic, particularly Jupiter and Venus. Then we have the midbrains, which are the flywheels of the solar system itself, the most massive bodies, Sun and Jupiter, activating the midbrain. And that, of course, is an octave of the Schumann resonance, as it chances to be. So the Schumann resonance is critical in getting a balance of the pillars of the tree of life, as it were, between the pillar of severity and the pillar of mercy. I should add here that there's actually no true middle pillar in the solar system, because the Sun and Jupiter don't really go directly on center between these other two groups. They're off to one side. They only tend to come in toward the center. So it's really up to us and our consciousness to do the true balancing. The solar system itself only points the way. And therein lies our free will, so-called.
We are part of this.
But we're part of this situation as long as we don't leave the Earth and leave the solar system. And as integral parts, it's up to us. It's our responsibility to balance ourselves in such a way that we feed back positively with what's in the cosmos. So if we can relate in a constructive way at the Schumann resonance, then we're going to be doing our part to harmonize the planet, harmonize civilization. This will in turn drop the amount of crime, and it'll drop the amount of wars that we have.
Shifting the subject again a little bit, going back to Tesla and his work and how what happened with him in the Schumann resonances, and how did that all come together?
Okay, let's speak briefly about Nikola Tesla, who over the period around the turn of the century was investigating electromagnetic phenomena, and in the process actually fathered the modern electronic age, because he came up with most of the ideas for the inventions like radio and TV and so on before others who are typically given the credit like Marconi did. Tesla had a laboratory in Colorado, and he had another one in New York. His great dream was to put out non-centralized electric power all over the globe from a central broadcasting station. Just one station, you just stuck a rod in the ground and you got your power. And he was going to do that using harmonics of the lithospheric Schumann resonance. And then, of course, the financiers found out about it, and it didn't agree with their plans, so they cut his funding, and the whole thing collapsed. Well, the studies that Tesla did about the lithospheric Schumann resonance led naturally to his studying the nodes of the Schumann resonance, that is, where 0 points of the wave going in and out around the Earth fell. And he began to get an inkling that there was actually a definite system of energies in the planet, although to my knowledge he didn't write too much about that. It remained for later researchers like Dr. Ivan Sanderson of the USA and some Russian researchers, Goncharov and Morozov and colleagues, to find in Russia that there was actually a grid of energies that went around the planet with nodes at the North and South Pole, and then there were 5 main foci that they could find in the Northern Hemisphere, and another 5 staggered or offset from the first ones in the Southern Hemisphere. If you connect those points, it's as if there was a crystal in the Earth's crust, as if it were an icosahedron. And they discovered furthermore that this crystal actually connected the centers of upwellings that made tectonic plates. And in the Russian modeling of that, the Earth is covered by actually only 12 tectonic plates. There's an upwelling at the middle of the plate, and it comes to the magma comes to the surface and then goes down at the edges in what are called subduction zones. And the forces that are set up by this motion help create an electromagnetic and infrared Earth energy grid. In fact, the Russian researchers were able to take pictures from a satellite that sometimes showed faint outlines of the grid lines of force in the clouds. This being closely related to the Schumann and closely related to the cosmic resonances of Astrosonics vis-a-vis the motion of the Earth around the Sun, which I call the Earth-Sun note, that particular resonance will be found in most cases to be the pulsation along the ribs of this icosahedral grid. So it's one of the main tones of nature along with the Schumann resonance.
What frequency is that?
It's actually a lowered C sharp. It turns out that some musicians stumbled upon this, like Jonathan Winter, who would like to take his sax out into nature and tootle away. He found that coyotes and wolves would join him when he hit a certain Paul Winter. He underblew a C sharp, and then the wolves would let loose. and it was just that note that they let loose with. Well, they were tuned into this grid pulsation that I'm talking about, which was an octave shift harmonic of the Earth's motion around the sun. It turns out that the lithospheric Schumann resonance of the ribs of the icosahedral grid now, the actual time it would take an EMF wave to go from one of these points in the northern hemisphere to another one, say the Bermuda Triangle to off of Midway, that would be about 42.5 cycles a second. And this turns out to be a direct octave shift of the joint cycle of Jupiter and Neptune. And you often find in people's astrological charts who have abilities in shamanism and natural healing that they have Jupiter and Neptune related conjunction across the sky or in quadrature. This is very common. And they're tuned directly to the rib of the icosahedral Earth grid and probably can draw energy from it to do their healing and balancing work.
Very interesting.
Now, I have in the Astrosonics field found a way to render the platonic systems like icosahedron that we've been talking about for the Earth grid as sound, such that when you hear it and close your eyes, you often can see the thing form an inner space. In fact, in blind tests, we've been able to show that almost anyone can do that. Now, when you tune this to the Earth-Sun note and play a chord that represents a blending of icosahedron and dodecahedron, then you expand in consciousness and contact this whole Earth energy grid. This is the step up in refinement of the consciousness spread that you get by tuning into the Schumann resonance. Explain these Earth grids in more detail by backtracking first of all to what is an icosahedron. This is one of 5 of the perfectly regular ways of dividing space such that all the edges, faces, and angles are the same. This is composed of 20 triangles, 30 edges, and 12 vertices, icosahedron. This is the main shape of the Earth energy grid. If we have here the North Pole and this one is the South, then let's let that be the Bermuda Triangle. This would be just off of Midway Island. This would be approximately off the southeast coast of Japan. This one would be Karachi, Pakistan, roughly. And this would be Chinachane, Algeria. And then back to the Bermuda Triangle again to give you a geographic orientation for it. Now, the lithospheric Schumann resonance between 2 of these points resonates the joint cycle of Jupiter and Neptune and also Sun and Venus, which is why a Sun and Venus calendar has been important to Mesoamerican people, Tibetan people, and in other civilizations around the world. The resonance of the Earth's motion around the Sun, that Earth-Sun frequency, is a modulation on that lithospheric Schumann resonance. And if you combine these two, you have a very effective way of getting in touch with Earth consciousness as a whole. And of course, you can influence it positively if you put out exactly what the grid calls for, its exact frequencies, the Earth-Sun note combined or modulated by the Schumann resonance. And here we have a copy of that, which is one of my Astrosonic generic tapes. This is the Solar Life Energy Chord 2 that you're about to hear. Notice the wah-wah effect. The boom-boom is not the Schumann, but the wah-wah-wah-wah is the Schumann resonance. The tonic note of this chord is an octave shift of the motion of the Earth around the Sun. The midpoints of the faces can be connected to make a pentagon, and when you do that, you have 12 pentagons enclosing the Earth's surface, making up a dodecahedron. These are approximately the tectonic plates as they actually occur on the Earth's surface. In the Russian modeling, they think magma comes up in a convection cell that comes up at the center and then subsides at the edges in the subduction zones of each of these plates. And apparently it's this process of the movement of the Earth's innards which has something to do with generating the forces that make up the grid itself.
Now, there's talk that the Earth resonance is decreasing in power.
Okay, well, the Earth's magnetic field is centered at magnetic poles. They're, about 70 degrees north latitude, somewhere in the area of Ellesmere Island presently, I think it is, or Baffin. If this is the North Pole, we're talking the magnetic pole would be about there, and the South magnetic pole diametrically opposed there, if this is the South Pole. And as the observations indicate, that field is decreasing in intensity as if the Earth's magnetic poles are getting ready to reverse, which they periodically do. And supposedly we're several 100,000 years now overdue for a shift of the magnetic poles. And of course, as that happens, the whole regime of the Schumann resonance is going to be changing too. The fact is, the field drops in intensity. Animals are finding it harder and harder to get their normal navigational signals for migrations, especially north and south. So it would behoove us, wherever possible, to tune in on the natural Schumann resonance and boost it in our area and create or recreate a magnetic field that would hold the biosphere together in its natural form. This can be done with small devices that have been made by researchers like Dr. Robert Beck in the USA. And there are others in Germany that have followed suit. If you'd like to know more about the Earth grid situation and how it related to Tesla's work, read Tom Bearden's book, B-E-A-R-D-E-N, Tom Bearden, Excalibur Briefing. The Excalibur Briefing came out sometime in the late 70s. It's a Cherry Hill Press book, a Walnut book under Cherry Hill Press, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, now a little bit more about how the icosahedron, whose ribs you see here, interplays with the dodecahedron of the tectonic plates. When you interlace these, you have a situation where there are 62 different intersection points. These two are valid Earth energy grid vortices, as they're known, just as there's major vortices here at the vertexes of the icosahedron, and also at the main subduction zones where three plates meet at the center of a face. Those two are vortexes of an opposite quality. In fact, the ones here transmit the denying cosmic impulse, whereas these transmit an affirmation, and these a reconciliation. Now, that's important for future research work. Now, I can represent in sound how the two networks go together, and this is called the solar icosadodecacord. This again is a generic tape available from me in the Astrosonics work. According to one of my contacts, Bruce Mace, who's something of an expert in whale and dolphin lore, he says that 3 of the great whales will sometimes meet at one of these vertex points, and then around them schools of thousands of dolphins will circulate in a spiral and do a dance around the 3 whales. And that in doing this they set up a time-space door into other dimensions.
Has he seen this happen?
I don't know that he's actually witnessed it himself, and I can't quote what his sources are on that, but this would tend to indicate that the cetaceans do know and use the forces of the Earth energy grid. Oh, I Is this still running?
Yeah.
Okay. I did a statistical study of about 500 hit songs and found what their tonic key was, and then plotted that out. And I discovered that B minor was the least used key. It's as if people want to be either in the left brain or the right brain, and they don't care to be centered in the key of B. This makes works like Bach's Mass and B minor immensely important compared to what you might think they were in terms of what they can tune you in to nature by.
B minor is what in relationship to what you've been talking about?
Well, the key of B is an octave of the Schumann resonance approximately. And it acts as a left-right brain or midbrain activation frequency and helps coordinate the hemispheres. So music that's done in the key of B has this property of helping people balance their left and right halves. And that's exactly what is least prominent in the popular repertoire. Well, you can study, as the Native Americans did and the kahunas did, the rhythms of waves and the like. Like the kahunas would not do chants on the beach unless the surf were in harmony with the rhythm of their intended purpose. Now, I found the American Indians also instinctively and even consciously know something about astrosonic rhythms. I had visited the Santo Domingo Pueblo once with a French conductor who had a good watch, and we actually counted the timing of the beats during a rain dance. And it turned out that they were following a pattern whereby 3/4 of the time they were stomping out about 3 to 3.5 cycles a second, which is pure Neptune, a water planet, and a water sign ruler in astrology. And then the other quarter of the time they stomped out about 2 to 2.5, and 2.2 is pure Pluto. That's another water sign ruler. And yes, they did get results. A storm formed right over the village where they were doing this. So the nature spirits and devas do tend to respond to astrosonic rhythms where they're knowingly applied. My conductor friend asked one of the Indians if they knew that they were stomping in a rhythm, and then the Indian practically finished the sentence, "Yes, we know it's Neptune and Pluto," and astounded us both. Apparently this is a leftover of Atlantean technology that is known to a few of the Indians consciously.
What are the frequencies of the other planets? The major, do they all have major frequencies? Or?
Well, if you look at the orbits in an idealized fashion as if they were circles instead of ellipses, which they actually are closer to, then you have an average frequency for each body. And these tend not to approximate any notes on the piano tuned to A440. They step up in what at first appears to be an irregular sequence, but our mutual friend Shine Richards showed that in fact it was simple fractions times the power of the golden section that related them.
The Earth itself, though, is related to the A440 scale? The frequencies that are predominant?
Well, it does only in the sense that it relates to certain planetary cycles that are octaves of A440. For example, the Jupiter-Saturn joint cycle or the Maya-Katun 20-year cycle. It's the same thing. These scale up as an A. Also, the joint cycle of Mercury and Sun, the joint cycle of Moon and Mars, and the simple cycle of Venus around the Sun is also an A. All these are fairly closely octaves of each other. I put them together onto an Astrosonics tape, which is called the chakra balancer, because eventually it hits everything and aligns everything.
But in the same sense, focusing the consciousness on the Schumann resonances gets us closer in touch with the Earth resonance.
It'll get you not only in touch with the Earth, but beyond that, the joint cycle of Sun and Jupiter, the joint cycle of Mars and Jupiter, of Mercury and Jupiter, and of Saturn and Neptune. All of those are just about octaves of each other. And typically when people can't handle the issues of one, if they hear the Schumann resonance, they'll bounce off in their body into some other area. Like typically, if they have a Mercury-Mars issue, they may bounce off into, say, Saturn and Neptune and go down into this area. Or if they can't take the sacral issues, then they'll bounce up into, say, Sun, Jupiter and go into the crown. But this is something that's an individual matter, and at this point in my studies, I have no way of predicting beforehand just where somebody's going to go as to which one of these resonant stops they're going to land in. I can calculate what the resonant stops are, but I don't know just which one they're going to move to at this point. So if you're a musician and you want to experience getting in touch with the earth in terms of the Schumann resonance, try working a lot in the key of B as a tonic. And this should begin to get you in tune to that. Or if you have a stringed instrument that you can detune easily, try dropping your C sharp about a third of a semitone, and you'll be acceptably close to the earth-sun note, and find out what this does for you. Now, some Eastern musicians are inwardly in touch all the time and can hear their own inner sounds. The lower division of the cosmic sounds that are heard inwardly do respond in our astrosonic pitches typically. I worked with one well-known sitarist who didn't know which of 2 days he was born. So I had him work with a variable sweep oscillator and stop every time he came to a familiar frequency. And when he had a dozen or so of these, we stopped, and each one of these turned out to be a harmonic of a Mercury-Mars conjunction in one of the two charts. And to me, that fairly well settled the issue because he'd been playing with that for several years. So we naturally do have these inner frequencies, and we can attune to them if we're just sensitive, and will not restrict ourselves by sticking an unnatural framework like A440 on top of ourselves. We just try to find the inner sound by some process like Laurel Keys toning, where you slide your voice up in a smooth glissando until you find points that are particularly significant for you. If you'll do that and tune your instruments accordingly, then you'll probably find that this is the most you can do to work on your own issues, and hence on the planet and the universe.
Yeah.
Now, I can supply musicians with particular tones that go with issues that they're working on. I'd be happy to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I can also tell you times when these particular issues are being stimulated by current planetary transits. And as a classical improvisationist myself, I can tell you that your creativity will soar if you will work within the cosmic framework in this way. Oh, there was a traveler that I knew about who was doing meditations, and he was clairaudiently somewhat opened up. And he and his friends had been going through India some years ago, and he heard a couple of pitches that were predominant in the air throughout India. And he asked me, well, was there any astrosonic significance for those? The answer was yes, in terms of Earth resonance. One of them was an E flat that turns out that if you deform the Earth along the axis north to south pole, this is called the S2 mode of vibration. It's like the ellipsoid will be flattened and then elongated. And it does that with a cycle being about 55 minutes long. And this reduces, or can be reduced octavally, so that you get a frequency in the audio range that is an E flat about 20 octaves below middle C. So I think these people in India were actually hearing the S2 mode of the Earth, which was being tuned into and amplified by the meditators in the area. And the other thing they heard was that lowered C sharp note. And this definitely, I think, was the result of many meditators in that area of India being focused on the crown chakra in that degree of consciousness, so they could actually hear an ambience of that particular note in the atmosphere there. So this shows what can be done if enough people will just tune in on the right frequencies and keep their awareness clearly there for a defined period of time.
And that C sharp, the detuned C sharp is...
It's kind of a fiducial frequency for all of Astrosonics. Now the Egyptians knew about it. Turns out that that's actually, when converted into a wavelength at ordinary temperatures, it converts to a wavelength of about 25 inches in one of its octaves. That's a sacred cubit. Why is it sacred? It activates the spirituality of the crown chakra. Well, Tesla had wanted to create a global network of free energy and communication, or at least very minimal cost energy, where a central projecting tower, which looked like a giant mushroom, by the way, would be sending EMF signals out through the Earth's crust. And these signals would be tappable by anyone who had a conductor that they could stick in the ground, and then create a circuit through that stake in the ground. Like, say they had a light bulb in there. Tesla himself was able to light light bulbs out to several miles away from his transmitter in the Denver, Colorado area. Also, this could be used for communication, same principle. You put the information in at one point and it's accessible from any other around the globe. With intensities that vary according to node factors of this Earth grid.
And that was by putting the energy out at a certain frequency then? From this mushroom tower?
Right, he had to use the Schumann resonance or other Earth energy grid factors in order to get global coverage with a minimal amount of energy. Now, you could put out lots of energy at the wrong frequency, but it would take immense amounts compared to putting out at exactly the right resonant frequency.
Right.
So he had this wonderful scheme in mind that would have decentralized our power system and greatly cheapened it for the average consumer. Unfortunately, again, the financiers saw their profits threatened and withdrew his support. And then started to read him out of history so that other people wouldn't get these ideas.